Hi, I'm John Blanchard,
And I'm Matt McCann.
and today, for our Environmental Justice Slidecast, we are discussing the economic and food crisis in Venezuela that has been going on for the past few years, and specifically, we will be focusing on the bread war that has broken out just recently in the past few months.
The underlying issue in Venezuela is one of food sovereignty, or the ability of a culture or nation to have control over their food. In order to have food sovereignty, a nation must be able to provide enough food for its people. Those that are suffering from this case of food injustice are the people of Venezuela, and the one that is most responsible for the continued suffering is the current president, Nicolas Maduro. In 2013, then Vice President Nicolas Maduro had assumed the role of presidency after Venezuela's previous president, Hugo Chavez, had died due to complications from cancer. Before his death, Chavez had publicly endorsed Maduro for presidency if Chavez's cancer were to get the best of him, and it did.
After Maduro had served the 30-day period as interim president, a special election was held to elect a new president in April of 2013. With the help of Chavez's endorsement and access to the same political ties that Chavez had, President Maduro had won the election for a 6-year term with the United Socialist Party of Venezuela.
Since Venezuela's economic crisis in 2014, there have been protests resulting from shortages of goods and worsening living standards. These protests have led to a big loss in Maduro's popularity and has sparked a movement toward recalling him in 2016. Maduro had continued to hold on to power through the use of his political connections, including the Supreme Court and the military.
Historically, Venezuela has been a very affluent oil industry, but as a socialist nation, the government siphons money from the industry for other needs. This trend was prevalent through the Chavez administration and got even more extreme under Maduro. The 2015 plunge in oil prices doomed the nation as the government could no longer afford to provide for its people. The economic collapse has been staggering. Venezuela is typically South America's most affluent nation with a GDP per capita close to $17,000. By 2020, they are projected to make just over $3,000 GDP per capita. Inflation is expected to increase by 700% by 2020.
Because Venezuela's economy is so heavily dependent on its oil industry, the country's supply of basic goods is highly reliant on the country's ability to import such goods like food and flour. Due to its dramatic rise in inflation, Venezuela can no longer afford to import the same amount of food that it did previous to the country's oil crisis. It is a combination of the economic crisis, hyperinflation, and lack of food sovereignty that has led to the current food shortages that the country suffers from. Under recent regulations carried out by the Maduro administration, of the flour that bakers receive from the government at a subsidized rate, bakers are required to use 90% of it strictly for baking bread. Bakers are allowed to use the other 10% of their flour for other baked goods like pastries and cakes. Despite the government's new regulations, the shortages still persist. President Maduro had accused individuals that run these bakeries of destabilizing his government by hoarding the flour to make cakes and pastries instead. The bakers accuse fault on the socialist government for not importing more flour in order to meet the demand of the Venezuelan people's basic dietary needs.
In the country's capital city, Caracas, lines form outside of Carlos Coelho's bakery 2 hours before the shop opens. Coelho makes about 500 baguettes a day. He would make more, but he only receives a fraction of the flour he needs per week. Since the food shortages, Coelho only receives 26 100-pound sacks a week. But in order to make the regular demand of bread, he needs 150. In exchange for bread, 2 policemen guard his shop from customers and to ensure fights don't break out. Customers are let in 5 at a time and are limited to 2 baguettes per person. Because of the economic crisis, almost all pay with credit card. Within 40 minutes of a bakery opening, Coelho's is sold out of bread.
A new study from the National Survey of Living Conditions, conducted by 3 Venezuelan universities, suggests that 75% of the country's population has lost an average of 19 pounds due to the nationwide food shortage. The study has also found that approximately 33% of the population is eating no more than 2 meals a day. It has proven difficult for organizations to assist in the food shortage in Venezuela due to President Maduro's decision to refuse any foreign aid or assistance from NGOs worldwide. Even domestic NGOs that aim to alleviate human rights in Venezuela, such as Provia, have been accused by President Maduro for accepting foreign aid in attempt of conspiracy.
Diplomats from the Organization of American States have convened in Washington to make efforts to restore Venezuela from its current dysfunctional state. The OAS pondered removing the country from the organization completely. However, they assessed that, though the actions would be justified, it would not bring Venezuela any closer to recovery.
It is important for the country's immediate issues to be alleviated, which means that the President Maduro must be pressured to begin accepting foreign aid. In September of last year, Peruvian President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski called for a group of countries, including Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, to begin sending aid in the form of medicine and food.
This is not the first time a crisis like this has occurred. The Soviet Union dealt with a similar issue of food sovereignty in the late 1970s, early 1980s, leading up to the dissolution in 1991. During its food crisis, the Soviet Union could not support its population in food and other basic amenities. In an attempt to bolster the industrialization of the USSR, farmers were forced to leave their fields for factories. Soviet industry successfully held up the economy, which, thanks to socialism, kept the depleted agriculture industry afloat. Eventually, industry collapsed and the rest of the Union followed.
Several different news organizations have been covering the food shortages in Venezuela. We came across this topic by the surplus of news content found over the internet. Leading news companies like CNN, The New York Times, The Independent, Public Radio International, and many more have covered the issue through standard reporting. Associated Press has gone into Venezuela to conduct an investigative report to explore just how severe the living conditions and food shortages have become. Most, if not all, of the media sources share an opinion that blame the current president Nicolas Maduro for the lack of any immediate resolution to the food shortage issue that faced the country.